What really motivated me to write about time dimension in policy transfer were a couple of things. I mean, the topic of traveling reforms, reforms that move from one country to another, and the global actors that push out those reforms, fund them, advocate for them. That one is not that new. I've worked on that for the last 30 years, and also how different countries receive or adopt or import those reforms selectively. That's also not new. What is really new is the time dimension. And I try to dig deeper to show how the reform itself changes over time, why something gets adopted at a particular time, the whole timing issue, etc. So there are different aspects of time that I realized it has been underexplored, and it would be good to put it under cover in a book. There are two events in my life, so to say, that really helped me to think about the book. One was about 20 years ago. Together with Iveta Silova, we were in a project that was funded at the time by the Soros Foundation. And we convened policy analysts, education researchers from post-Soviet or post-socialist countries, including Mongolia, but also Central Asia, Caucasus, and Mongolia. There were 7 countries involved. And it was interesting for us to see how all these countries, early 90s, were in the same situation in adopting and changing their school systems into a more Western, post-socialist system, which involved, for instance, extending the years of schooling. It involved changing from Russian to English, etc. But they all went into different directions. The second thing, so this was the whole idea how things move and how they change over time, because some countries then adopted reforms right away, others, the trajectories were different, others took time and they changed or they resisted. That was one thing that really made me think about traveling reforms and pushed my research forward. The other thing was I had my sabbatical when I wrote the book, and I was at Stanford as a visiting scholar, and there I got acquainted with this amazing database that Patricia Bromley and Ria Kijima, who is now at the University of Toronto, put together. It's called the World Education Reform Database. And this word, or the World Education Reform Database, by now has over 10,000 policy documents that they collected at the global level from OECD, the World Bank, UNESCO, and other organizations. And what they saw is like a reform bubble or an era of extreme, many changes, legislative changes. And this period was between 1992 and 2008. They call it, and I agree with them, they call it the era of neoliberal reforms. So these two thoughts, that countries move at different paces, have different trajectories with adopting regional reforms in the first case, but now in this case, global reforms really drove me, and I found that interesting to dig deeper. So any reform, or actually every project, has different components and aspects, and they together then are supposed to make a change. So, for instance, the global reform or the neoliberal reform that was between 1992 and 2008 in most countries had features that were closer to school-based management or autonomy of schools. It included also decentralization of decision-making, devolution of decision-making to the local or municipal level. It involved professionalization of school management. It involved per capita financing. So that was more everything that had to do with school autonomy. And then over time, and that's really important that it's over time, it's not right away. So school autonomy was first. Once school autonomy was there, a can of worms opened up. Many problems with inequality, with erosion of quality, especially in schools that were not chosen, but they were the rest schools. Once you had this, and especially with the change in political parties from more conservative parties to more central or central left parties, they insisted that standards are introduced so that to an end to this wild west of school autonomy, to introduce curriculum standards, to introduce accountability standards. So this was the second phase, and the second phase was accountability. And as part of this accountability, it started off with national standardized curricula in many countries. And once you have those standards, you have evaluations. In the beginning, you had many evaluations, parents, inspectors, feedback systems and all that. Over time, it became more and more narrow towards standardized testing. So the right side is all about keeping schools accountable for what they do. At the same time, it was a shift from when I worked at the Ministry of Education in Zurich, it was all about regulating norms and inputs. More and more, the role of the state moved towards regulating outcomes. In other words, as long as schools demonstrate that the students are learning something according to those tests and the standardized curriculum, the state was supposed not to interfere. So that shift from input regulation to outcomes regulation was part of this era, this neoliberal reform era. This is only half of the story. The other half, and this is where I got inspiration from Anthony Verger, but also in the beginning, Susan Robertson. They talked about the mechanism of change, the market model during that period. And they talked about the market model in education and the assumptions of that model. The assumptions of the model was that if you set up schools for competition with each other by making, for instance, funding dependent on how many students they enroll, that this is good for schools and this is good for the quality, because it's like the market, the free market. When you have more products, when parents have choice, and there is an evaluation system where the grades of students are made public or are available, then parents, of course, school choose that are doing better. So this mechanism of how competition is supposed to improve the quality of education is more than just the element of those two packages, the school autonomy package and the accountability package. So what I ended up doing is also analyzing the instruments of change, but also the policy goal. We have a century of incredible educational expansion where more and more people go to school for a longer and longer period of time. And I'm not going to bring numbers here, but I have a whole chapter in that book that analyzes how governments dealt with this huge challenge of satisfying the demand for schooling and for more and more diverse group of students that are involved. So one of the things that the neoliberal era was promising, and it was a promise that was broken ultimately, was that you can have better schools, higher quality schools, by cutting the costs, by being more efficient, being more cost effective, by introducing accountability measures. And this was the buy-in of governments. And what I want to show in that book, that this reform was mainly driven by ministries of finance. And that's where my background comes in policy studies. And I see myself as a policy person because I've worked for 10 years for government. Policy transfer or policy mobility, or I call it policy borrowing, is something that is closely associated with comparative education, both for those that are in applied comparative education, but also those that study policy transfer. There's a big difference between these two groups. The first group tries to learn from experiences in other countries, tries to study best practices, and then actually promote transfer and promote dissemination of best practices. That's, I would say, the normative approach to policy transfer. And the other group is, and this is what this book is all about, tries to understand why from the many, many best practices that are circulating the globe and from many global education policy, why some are picked up and some are not, why some travel and how they travel and whether it matters if the early adopters of a reform are from certain countries or if it doesn't matter, etc. So we are looking into analytical questions of policy transfer. The reason why this is so close to our field is because you need to look beyond the narrow national boundaries of your country. You need to get a sense of which reforms travel and are adopted in different countries. So you need to have a transnational look and also actually a global perspective, because the global perspective brings to the light that policy transfer in countries that voluntarily adopt it, such as rich countries like OECD countries, is quite different than policy transfer in countries that get loans and grants from the World Bank or get grants from Global Partnership for Education or UNESCO. They are more coerced into adopting some reforms because they are part of the package. That's what they get the funding for. So not only is it important to be comparative and compare how countries adopt selectively packages, global reform packages. So it has to be comparative, but it also has to be transnational. We have to look at the role of global actors, and it has to be global. We have to look into how transfer plays out differently in countries of the global north than in countries of the global south. In the book, I'm addressing 7 temporalities. Some of them are, of course, better known than others, and I try to discuss them one by one and show which ones have already been discussed, and we should take that into account, and which ones are relatively new and which ones need to be discussed more. So let me start with in the chronological order in how I discuss them in the book. The first one, I call it the present. Another way of saying is the historical period, during which period, and I always use SAVA or school autonomy with accountability as an example because it was a global reform, which is the neoliberal reform between 1992 and 2008. If you use present as an analytical tool, as an analytical temporal tool, to understand why it emerged in that period, you can see that education systems were tackling the challenge of funding and managing educational expansion. And what it meant is governments did not have the funds to satisfy the huge demand for education. So as a result, they started to decentralize from the central level to municipal level and local level. And there were different countries used different approaches. But decentralization was a very popular one. In China, they call it eating from separate pots. So this way you can, distribute the finances and the burden of administration. But there were also other strategies that governments used. One of them is to cut expenses and make it more efficient. So that was part of the historical context, how to deal with this, because it was in the 1990s, for example, in the 1990s in Europe, they had the Maastricht treatment, where the OECD actually, they agreed, the ministries of finance, to cut public expenditure because they were just about to introduce the euro, the same currency. It sounds for education researchers irrelevant, but it's actually really important that the pressure to cut costs had fiscal and financial reasons. It had to do with the introduction of a currency. And countries, because they became part of the same financial market, they agreed to cut public expenditure. So new public management was a response to this pressure to get the household financially in order. So that historical context really matters. Of course, in the UK, other countries, it was the oil crisis. It was the unions that put pressure on government. So it was the era of Thatcher and Reagan. That really is important, that it was part of the Tories in the UK and it was part of the Republican Party in the US. So this is the historical context. So the early adopters were actually Anglophone countries. They were Australia and New Zealand and the UK and the US. And they had similar political constellations. The second temporality, that's actually relative new scholarship. It came from political science and international relations. In education, colleagues such as Susan Robertson made it popular to talk about the role of global actors to have this futuristic project. And then, of course, Maren Elfert and Christian Edison picked it up for the World Bank and OECD and UNESCO, how global actors, through international agreements, depict a future. And not only do they depict it as a vision, but eventually with more and more indicators, and this is my own era of research, but also Roser Cousseau from Paris, for example, with bringing more and more indicators, they make it manageable and measurable and monitorable. And this is what global actors do, and this is how global actors, in the absence of coercion, become influential on national development. First, by developing indicators, by making countries comparable, then measuring whether countries move towards that joint future that one agreed on. In this case now, Sustainable Development Goals. So this is the whole idea of there's a political dimension to discussing the future. And right now, actually, every single Ministry of Education under the guidance of OECD is depicting the future they would want to have in education. So there is now this whole compass metaphor, like which direction do we want to go? And this is a way also to influence school reform at country level. I feel very passionate about sequence. I think that's really underexplored because, as I said, I discuss Sava, and sometimes Sava is discussed as if it would be one concept, and we forget that it came sequentially. It was school autonomy first, and then accountability second. And in fact, the World Bank talks about school autonomy, accountability, and assessment. Assessment is actually the third stage. And the reason why sequence is so important is it bothers me that colleagues and students still talk about neoliberal reform, and they forget that this is over. This was over in 2008. And it moved towards e-government, digital government, public governance reform. And with every reform that comes, the reform looks down at the previous one and presents itself as a solution to all the ills and all the problems that the previous reforms had. So that's really important to look how in which sequence reforms were introduced and what they said they would remedy, because that's how they situated themselves within this temporal order of things. What is also important in the sequence is, and I mentioned that earlier, that many reforms are handed down from ministries of finance to ministries of education and other line ministries. We are not in a vacuum in public education. We are part of a bigger public administration, and as part of public administration reform, we have to adopt them. And I was able to see that very clearly in Iceland, where I spent time at the University of Iceland during my sabbatical, where I found documents together with my colleagues Magnusdóttir and Johannesdóttir. We were able to see how the Ministry of Finance instructed the Ministry of Education to come up with measurable outputs so that the ministries of finance could outsource the procurement of public goods and services. And sometimes in education, we forget that new public management was at the same time as new procurement laws. The idea, and that's why privatization of education is so closely associated with neoliberal reforms. Part of new public management was to have new procurement, that governments and ministries were forced to make bids public for the procurement of goods and services. And once the system is not closed anymore, which means once it's not just the Ministry of Education contracting their own institutions, schools and districts, but once you open it up to the private sector, you have to have standards, you have to have expected deliverables, you have to have measurements to show whether the deliverables were met. And this is the beginning of the era of tests and standards and accountability. And that's why it's linked, privatization of education and introduction of standards and tests are linked. And again, it's a mixture where sequence is really important. Timing is an issue that has been discussed for a long time. Jürgen Schriever in Berlin did that by calling it externalization. I did that particularly for policy studies. He was more interested in bigger issues. I'm, as a policy person, interested at which particular moment do our governments open to change. And in policy studies, there's tons of literature on that topic. All the punctuated equilibrium theories in policy studies address that issue. And their point is there are periods where not much is happening, and then suddenly change is happening. And they're looking into the timing of when this change is happening. So, the classic theories of multiple streams framework talk about it, but many, many others. And for me, it was just a matter to making them known within our community of comparative policy studies and education research. Lifespan is something that for a long time fascinated me. And already when I used to work in Mongolia, I noticed that rarely do we look back 10, 15, 20 years back and see which of the reforms that were implemented back then are still in place. So some reforms, they stay, they change, of course, over time, but some of them were implemented and either on purpose were phased out or just hollowed out, as Michel Moraes would say. They became irrelevant or they were not really enforced. And the issue of lifespan tries to address this and try to understand why do some live longer than others. Aging is also a phenomenon that is not discussed enough because a reform repurposes itself, reinvents itself over time. And there are wonderful studies that, for instance, Mubarak Hossain from London School of Economics did on the use of AMIS, Education Management and Information System, or on datafication that we are doing now. There's a new book coming out with Anthony Verger, Trisha Bromley, Kerstin Martens, and Ria Kojima, and we look into datafication, how the use of data has changed over time, and especially data for accountability. It has been repurposed several times. So with any reform that ages, in order to stay up to date and interesting and relevant, reinvents itself. So we are looking in the new forthcoming book, actually, into how data for accountability has changed over time. So what we are looking at concretely is actually the aging of this reform. The tempo one is really interesting, and the tempo of reform has to do with the diffusion of innovation. And the diffusion of innovation is actually the lazy S-curve. The lazy S-curve shows how reforms travel over time. It is an epidemiological model. It assumes that a reform starts with a few countries, not just with one country necessarily, with a few countries, and then for a variety of reasons that I'll discuss right now, suddenly disseminates and is adopted by many, many countries. That's the explosive phase. And then eventually, when most of the countries adopted it, it reaches a phase of saturation and it burns out. And we all, we are like a post-COVID era. We can relate to that very much. There's like early adopters and then pandemic growth and then saturation or immunization, and then it burns out. Same way rumors spread that way, or fashion spread that way. It starts with a few, and then there's explosive growth, and it burns out. Now, the question is, what makes a reform travel faster than others? Again, does it matter who the early adopters are? And the answer is yes. If it's countries from the global north, the reform travels. The likelihood that it travels is bigger. And why? Is because global actors are more closely aligned in their agendas with the agenda of powerful countries like the US or OECD countries that are the rich countries. So early adoption really matters. But also once global actors, they come in, they put fuel into that engine and it really picks up speed because they put funding behind it, if it's a regional bank or the World Bank. But also they put knowledge and policy advice into it, like in the case of OECD and other think tanks. They provide examples of, and how do they do that? By providing examples of best practices, by documenting it on their platforms, by organizing study visits where they can learn from each other. So the tempo is something that is closely associated with global actors. At some point, a reform becomes nobody's and everybody's reform, and it is considered an international standards, even though we are not able to define what exactly the standard is, but policymakers and politicians refer to it as a global trend or as an international standard. And at that point, nobody wants to be left behind. And that's when it really spreads like wildfire. It's really important to differentiate between what is traveling and what sticks. There are many global reforms or best practices that are circulating the globe, it doesn't mean that countries really adopt it. The big question is, how do we measure whether change is happening and whether a reform travels? I think we have not explored that question enough. Right now, the way most of us do it, including myself, we look whether there's a policy document that indicates change, whether something has changed in terms of laws or decrees or regulations. But mind you, this is a very narrow view of change. This is just a legislative view of change or policy in a narrow sense. But we know from the policy studies, public administration studies, there is a whole governance toolkit. Changing laws is just one of it. Another way, there are at least 5 different tools of how change is triggered by the government itself. One is by laws. Another one is by persuasion or information. A third one is by contracting. A fourth one is by giving incentives, like grants for institutions to change. And the fifth one, and that's the newest one, is by performance evaluation, by monitoring, by standard setting, and then evaluating those standards. So when we talk about what travels and what sticks, we should actually look at all 5 types of change and tools and instruments of change, and not just legislative changes. And that's why sometimes reforms stick only because grants were made available to them, and it's a bottom-up change that comes from schools. Not every change has to come from government. I tried to look at different dimensions of time, and I came up with 7 that are really important, but it would be wise to look at it in a more biblical sense. There could be more. And actually, in the last chapter, I address a couple options of how other temporalities could be discussed also. For example, my former doctoral student just finished a dissertation, Thomas Esper, where he looked at, I would call it time interrupted, how performance-based evaluation or testing of students was introduced in Argentina, then suspended, and then again picked up once Buenos Aires implemented it. So that would be maybe an 8th temporality. But also sometimes time is not chronological and linear in politics and in policy decisions. Sometimes policymakers reinvent the wheel. So they turn back and reinterpret, revisit their decision and their interpretations. And that's an example how time is not necessarily chronological and linear. And I tried to show that in that book throughout.